I'm joined by Ben Page. He's the Chief Executive of Pollster Ipsos Mori and a visiting professor at King's College London. Afternoon to you. Thanks for your time. Has this by-election just killed the prospect for Boris Johnson's government to pass any form of Brexit deal in Parliament? Surely that's going to be the big sticking point.
He's got his work cut out persuading this Parliament to sign up to any deal, and Mrs May clearly tried and failed for nearly 3 years. But what he'll be pleased about is the by-election saw the Conservatives, nearly win, and in the polls for the country as a whole, he's seen a bounce and seems to have pushed back the Brexit Party, which is the great existential threat to the Conservatives in a general election, which most people seem to agree is coming at some point in the next 6 months, pretty much, to be quite honest.
What do you think the Prime Minister's strategy is? Is it time to call a general election, perhaps?
Well, I think that, it looks, in terms of his personnel, the people he's chosen, some of the announcements, it looks very likely that, he's going to go and say that the European Union won't agree to any changes to the deal that they've got on the table, which is precisely what they've been saying. They've all gone on holiday now anyway. He'll then say the Parliament won't agree to no deal. They're thwarting the will of the British people from the referendum in 2016, and therefore we need to call a general election to settle the matter once and for all. And he will hope that at that election he's able to squash the Brexit Party because he's given enough signs that he's completely committed to leaving with no deal at all under any circumstances on the 31st of October. He crushes the Brexit Party. Labour are currently in disarray with one of the worst rated leaders of the opposition Ipsos Mori has ever measured, going back to the 1970s, and therefore he somehow gets a working majority and is able then to stay in power and do all the things that he wants to do.
What about the risk of a no-confidence vote in the Prime Minister?
Well, I think that's sort of in a way built in, and it's interesting that the opposition haven't tried one yet. Whether or not, the big question is whether or not some Conservatives who are so concerned about the impact of no deal on the economy are willing to vote against their own government and actually trigger that election. But either way, it looks as though, particularly with his bounce that he's got in the polls at the moment, in our latest Ipsos Mori poll, he's 10 points ahead of the Labour Party. It looks as though he would not necessarily regard that as a disaster. It's very difficult to know what would happen. But this is a high-stakes poker game that we're now in British politics. And, what we've seen in the past is Prime Ministers like Gordon Brown not using their bounce, an initial honeymoon period, and then later regretting it. So, frankly, an election looks pretty likely.
Pretty likely, but what are the pollsters saying about what the outcome might be? Let's say Mr Johnson called an election as early as next week.
Well, on the basis of the polls at the moment, assuming nothing changes, it looks as though he could get a slightly increased majority without having to govern with the DUP in Northern Ireland. But I mean, one of the problems with national polls in Britain, of course, is that they don't tell us what's going to happen in the marginals. And so, he has to be anxious. But I think the one thing we should remember, in 2017, the Conservatives ran a completely disastrous election campaign. They've been outspending all the other parties recently on testing out ads ready for a campaign on Facebook. I think it's unlikely that they would be so, to use an Anglo-Saxon expression, cack-handed in terms of how they ran the campaign next time. And Labour just are dividing and losing their own supporters. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn is not an electoral asset to the Labour Party. At the moment, Boris Johnson is seen by many more Britons as a likely best Prime Minister. He's at 52% of the British people choosing him, compared to, if they're forced to make a choice, only 27% for Jeremy Corbyn. So all of the sort of wins in some ways are in his favour. But no, it's a high-risk stakes. But Brexit is now high-risk stakes in Britain, frankly.
Ben Page, thank you ever so much. Chief Executive of Pollster Ipsos Mori.